This lecture review video examines the American Civil War and also the Age of Reconstruction. We can date the years of the American Civil War beginning in April of 1861 and also concluding in April of 1865. The period of Reconstruction commenced in 1865 immediately after the war and then continued until 1877. The American Civil War is the definitive event in American history. So much of what the country will become is determined by this event. This war, in many ways, was long coming. In many ways, the failure of the Founding Fathers to resolve the issue of slavery meant that the war would be inevitable or irrepressible. Indeed, a great question regarding the American Civil War is, at what point was the war irrepressible or inevitable? Was it inevitable once slaves first arrived in Jamestown in the 1620s? Or was it inevitable once the Constitution guaranteed so many freedoms but yet continued the institution of slavery? Or was it inevitable much later into the 1850s? That's a prime question that we can consider as we go forward. There are many causes of the American Civil War, like any other war, and we should be averse to identifying simply one cause as the prime reason for the commencement of the American Civil War. It is much better to think about the Civil War as a result of many long-term and short-term causes. Of course, the institution of slavery is of prime concern to both sides going into this war. The South felt that it was determined and necessary to secede from the Union in order to protect the institution of slavery, and the North, many in the North, only fought in the war to seek the extinction of the institution of slavery. The issue of secession, the right of a state to break away from the Union, is of prime concern also for the course of the American Civil War. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself envisioned the war really about preserving the Union and not about the extinction of slavery. If the extinction of slavery was necessary to save the Union, then he would be willing to abolish the institution. But for Lincoln, the war is really about prohibiting the right of a state to secede from the Union and preserving the Union established by the Founding Fathers. Sectionalism clearly is an issue that is a cause of the American Civil War. Many have argued that the North and the South are really two different countries, two different cultures, two different people, two different economies, two different political systems, two very different worldviews by April of 1861. And conflict between these two institutions were a paramount reason for the descent into war. The question of states' rights is also very important as well. What are the rights of a state in a federalist system? How far does the power of a state extend when there is a central federal government? That, of course, is the basis of the Southern argument for secession, and it's also of prime concern for many in the North who fought to preserve the Union. And also the issue of protectionism, by which we mean protective tariffs. To what extent, economically, can the government seem to favor and protect one area of the country, one region and its economy, particularly through protective tariffs in the industry of the North, at what was perceived as the expense of another region, the agricultural South? So there are many reasons for the coming of the Civil War. There are many people who fought the war for different reasons. War is always a very personal reason why people go off to war. It can be simply a matter of trying to impress a girlfriend or a wife, or because your buddies in your town are often also going off to war, and it doesn't necessarily have philosophical reasons. So there are very many different reasons for the course of the war, but these are some of the primary reasons for the causes of the American Civil War. Comparing the sides of the American Civil War, we can see that in many ways the Confederates are very much outnumbered, much as the Americans were against the British in the American Revolutionary War. The Southerners, or the Confederates, have a smaller population. They have far less industry than the North. They also do not have moral justification on their side as far as worldwide opinion. There are very few around the world, other countries, that are going to be willing to support this Southern cause of defending slavery. In many ways, the resources of the South are far less than what they were in the North. This chart compares everything from population to men of fighting age and also production. And as you can see, by the abundance of blue as opposed to the orange, the Union states clearly outnumber and overwhelm the Confederate states in every single category except regarding cotton production, which clearly cotton is considered the prime agent for negotiation and the hope of the South in order to get other countries to join their side. There's also a strange reality as we head into the Civil War that the states in the middle, often known as the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, all of these states are slave states in which there are individuals who have slave holdings, but yet they do not secede from the Union. There is much division, much debate, even conflict, even armed conflict within these states, with one side that favored the Confederates that sought to get these states to secede and join the Confederacy, but also forces of the Union, of the federal government, that make sure that these states do not secede. And so in between the northern states where the institution of slavery is abolished by state law and the southern states where slavery predominates, these border states are obviously very much contested and an area of division. West Virginia does not start the Civil War as a state admitted to the Union, but because of its large mountain population that felt alienated and very different from the coastal tidewater and lower valley regions of Virginia, which was dominated by slavery, members of the mountain communities in Virginia secede, creating the state of West Virginia, which is admitted to the Union in the middle of the war in 1863. However, on the side of the South, despite that they are completely overwhelmed in regard to industry and population and the resources of the North, clearly what favors the South is the issue of morale, in which there's a lot of motivation and excitement, at least at the beginning of the war, to secede from the Union. The South is also fighting on its own home turf. Therefore, it knows the land, it knows the geography far better than the invading Northerners. The Southern Army simply has to survive against Northern encroachment. If it can do that, it will survive and achieve the success of the Revolution. The South is also aided by the very best regarding military command, which is going to be a struggle for the North throughout the war. For the Southerners, they realize that they are outnumbered in population and also industrial capacity, but for many of them, they believe that their cotton production will be the linchpin for motivating European states, particularly England and France, to join their side and secure their independent secession from the Union. This is known as cotton diplomacy, in the belief that Britain will intercede and help the Southerners to achieve their independence. However, the South really overplays its hand here, because despite British textile mills facing a significant disruption with Southern cotton coming from the United States, Britain simply turns to its very expansive colony of India to grow a lot of the cotton it needs for its manufacturing, and therefore never joins the Confederacy. A significant event of conflict occurs in 1861 between the Union, the federal government, and the British, when a British ship carrying 2 Confederate delegates is boarded by a federal ship, and those Confederate representatives are arrested. The British government feels insulted because it is simply trying to conduct diplomacy and is a violation of its sovereignty. Therefore, Lincoln releases these Confederate delegates, pointing out that it's best to fight one war at a time. But nevertheless, the Trent affair is really the only point of conflict and disagreement between the federal government and the British, and of course the British never joined the war. The South, particularly, is hampered in its conduct of the war because of the very significant northern blockade that surrounds all of the coast of the southern United States, the Confederate States. There's a large Union blockade that is designed around its coast, And the plan of General Winfield Scott from the very beginning that he submits to President Lincoln is what is called the Anaconda Plan, the idea of a great snake dividing up the Confederacy, strangling it, particularly through the use of that Union blockade. In many ways, even more than the Northern armies, the Union blockade of the Southern states is the most decisive factor for the reason why the North wins the war. But nevertheless, the North is also determined to carve up the Confederacy by securing control of the Mississippi River and dividing it north to south, and then gaining control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers and marching across Georgia, which divides the Confederacy as well. Therefore, this Union blockade, because of the large numbers of ships in the Union Navy, is a very decisive factor in curbing the economic success of the Confederacy during the war and making it extremely difficult to find basic goods, including food, gunpowder, ammunition, during the course of the war. The Union blockade is marked by very significant events, including this attack against Mobile Bay, Alabama, which shut down a very important shipyard and also a port of entry for goods. And therefore, the Confederates launch many efforts by privateers, private ship owners, to develop a ship that could quickly race past the Union lines or blast its way past the Union blockade and make it to ports in the Caribbean and also Europe to bring supplies back to the South. So there is a war offshore of the United States, even as there's battlefields on the land. One of the most significant naval battles, really the most significant naval battle of the American Civil War, is the Battle of Hampton Roads, March of 1862. In which, for the first time, two ironclad ships face each other, the Monitor and the Merrimac, which blast away at each other for numerous hours until both sides draw off. The significance of this battle is that it fails to break the Union blockade, but it marks the entrance of iron ships as a new age of sail, and really every other navy in the world is rendered obsolete that day, particularly with their wood ships and their sails. Also, other innovations, particularly regarding naval warfare during the American Civil War, include the introduction of the first submarine, the C.S.S. Hunley, which was a manually operated submarine that launched from Charleston Harbor through the assistance of a 10-member crew, 8-member crew that was instrumental in powering the submarine to submerge slightly below the waters. And on the front of the Hunley was a spar torpedo, an explosive device extended at its end that crashed into the USS Housatonic, blowing up the Housatonic and indeed sinking it. However, something happened in the course of the attack, and the Hunley itself was lost at sea, not to be discovered again until the 1990s, where it was removed from the sea in the year 2000. Like every other war, the American Civil War witnesses the introduction of a lot of new weapons of war, not just the submarine, but also these ironclad ships, also very large gunboats compared to the age of sail before it. Also very significant is the introduction of the French Minié ball. The Minié ball was a very dense lead bullet that was loaded into Union Confederate rifles that spun due to the introduction of rifling in the muskets. And as a result, because of its density and speed and spin, it would fracture on contact bodies and limbs. As a result, many soldiers who were shot in the arm, it necessitated them having their arms cut off and amputated because of the destructive effect of the Minié ball fired particularly from a rifled musket. We also see the introduction of siege mortars, which are these large siege pieces that could blast away trenches and earthenwork fortifications. Also repeating rifles or multi-barreled guns, Gatling guns, very primitive machine guns. Also grenades as well as balloons for surveillance. Also trenches that hearken forward to what is the reality of World War I, and also the introduction of mines to blast enemy opposing trenches through the use of tunnels and explosives. With the high death count in the American Civil War, we see a new attention to hospitals and field hospitals. The United States Sanitary Commission was created in the Union armies in order to tend to the sick and the wounded and promoted hygienic processes, particularly at these field hospitals. Clara Barton is remembered as the founder of the Red Cross and instrumental in bringing healing and health to a lot of soldiers who were injured in the course of the American Civil War. Before the war even begins, Abraham Lincoln loses his very best general in the Army. This is General Robert E. Lee, who had military experience in the Mexican-American War and also was instrumental in the arrest of John Brown during the Harper's Ferry raid. Lee decided that he could not betray his native Virginia, and so once Virginia seceded and joined the Confederate States, Lee decides to go with his native Virginia and offers his services to become Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Northern Virginia to the Confederate States. Therefore, for much of the course of the war, Lincoln is going to struggle in order to find a quality general. He will consider the very old and overweight Winfield Scott. He will also enlist the services of General Irving McDowell and also eventually settle on George McClellan and also use General John Hooker and also General Ambrose Burnside, as well as General George Meade, but eventually settle on General Grant, who had enjoyed some successes in the West, as well as William Tecumseh Sherman, who's going to be very important in the course of the Southern campaign. Skirmishes were breaking out very early in the course of the war, but the first major engagement takes place at the Battle of First Bull Run, also known as Manassas Junction, in which a Confederate army started to move against the Union capital at Washington, D.C., began marching north. General Irving McDowell, the Union general, meets them at Manassas Field. This battle takes place on July 21st, 1861, over this field. In the early course of the battle, where both sides are anticipating the other side will run and not fight and that the war will be a skirmish and be over very quickly, it appears that the Union is going to win the field early in the day. But because the Confederates are aided with a Virginian commander named General Thomas Jackson, and while many other Confederate units are running from the field, Jackson remains strong. Indeed, someone said, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall." The name stuck. And General Stonewall Jackson, who is a very religious man, as a result, rallies the Confederate troops and launches what is called the Great Skedaddle, in which Union troops are forced from the field and flee for their lives from the battlefield. And thus the Confederates win the first major engagement of the war. President Lincoln replaces General McDowell with the very obstinate but capable George McClellan. McClellan had very little respect for Lincoln as an individual. Lincoln had little respect for McClellan's willingness to prosecute the war and his endless delays and obfuscations. Seeing an opportunity in division within the Union ranks, General Lee decides to set up his fortifications around Richmond and contemplate invasions of the North. Lee will launch two significant invasions of the North in the course of the war. Finally, after extensive training, General McClellan launches the Union Army by floating them down the Chesapeake Bay and landing them on the James River Peninsula. They march across the peninsula in very adverse conditions through very thick woods and brush, and finally confront Lee in what is known as the 7-day battles. Lee routs McClellan, and McClellan simply retreats to where he originally started, frustrating Lincoln even more. Seeing the opportunity present before him, Lee orders General Jackson and his subordinates to raid the Shenandoah Valley, marching up and down throughout the valley, plundering numerous farms and plantations and homes for all the fodder and food that the Confederate Army will need for the next year or two in prosecuting the war in Virginia. Union troops and Union generals are completely unable to stop Jackson's famous Valley campaign. Lee decides in late 1862, in order to launch one of his first invasions of the North. Lee summons a very large army and then crosses over into the northern state of Maryland, hoping to round the state of Maryland and come down from the north to attack the city of Washington, perhaps even cut off Washington, the Union capital, from the rest of the North. McClellan, under the persistent urging of President Lincoln, finally rallies his troops and meets Lee's army at the Battle of Antietam Creek. At Antietam, this is the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War as far as one one day of battle. September 17th, 1862 is the bloodiest day in American history, with 25,000 lives lost on both sides, total for both sides at the Battle of Antietam. The Confederate troops repeatedly attacked Union forces over these fields in Antietam. Some of the most fierce fighting takes place in a sunken road in which Confederate troops lined up behind this earthwork and used it as a trench, and Northern troops continued to attack over the fields. Observers after the battle said that the bodies were laid 2 and 3 and 4 deep in this bloody lane after the course of the battle. There was also intense fighting over this bridge, in which a bunch of Georgian sharpshooters mowed down the Union troops as they endeavored to cross Antietam Creek. In the end, the significance of the Battle of Antietam is that Abraham Lincoln in the North finally has a significant victory. There was much pressure on Lincoln to emancipate the slaves from the very beginning of the war, but Lincoln felt like it would be a hollow gesture to simply emancipate the slaves in the southern states if the northern armies had not yet proven that they could even beat the southern Confederate armies. With the somewhat stalemate, or maybe victory, of Antietam, Lincoln decides shortly after to issue his famous Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation declared that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves will be emancipated, but only those in a state of rebellion. Only those states in a state of rebellion. So in other words, in some ways, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't emancipate a single slave. There are no slave states. There are no slaves in the northern states to be emancipated. It did not emancipate the slaves in the border states that were part of the Union, and it only claimed to emancipate the slaves that were in the southern states. But of course, President Lincoln and the Union troops really have no control over that area of the country at that time. Nevertheless, with the emancipation of the slaves, many African Americans flee to the Union lines as the Union starts to march across the South. There are also many Northern blacks who volunteered to become a part of segregated army regiments, the most famous being the Massachusetts 54th Regiment under the command of Robert Gould Shaw, who launches one of its more famous attacks against Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Lincoln remained frustrated with his lead general, General McClellan, for his continued delays and particularly his failure to follow up his victory at Antietam and chase down and destroy Lee's army. Therefore, Lincoln replaces McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside decides to take the initiative and to attack Lee and particularly go after the Confederate capital at Richmond. Therefore, he assembles a large army, the remnants of McClellan's army, and then crosses over into Virginia in an effort to attack Lee. Lee scurries back from his stalemate at Antietam and encounters the Union forces at Fredericksburg. Battle of Fredericksburg took place in the very cold winter of December of 1862, in which the Union troops developed pontoon bridges to cross over the river, the Rappahannock River, and make it into the town of Fredericksburg, quickly taking the town. And then General Ambrose Burnside launches an absolutely foolhardy attack over a wide open field against a high entrenched position of the Confederates. The Confederates on Marie Heights, opposite of this wide expanse of a field, have gun emplacements and Georgian sharpshooters behind this stone wall. Therefore, the Georgians, with their rifled muskets, which were incredibly accurate and deadly, just mow down the Union troops assault after assault as they tried to make it across this wide open field. The losses are horrendous for the Union troops, reaching 9,000 casualties, and eventually Burnside, admitting failure, is forced to withdraw. Burnside is replaced with General Joseph Hooker, who endeavors also to attack Lee along the Rappahannock River, but a little north on the Rappahannock River. He crosses the Rappahannock River, and then his camp bivouacs at Chancellorsville, sets up for the night. But during the course of the night, the Confederates attack the Union positions at Chancellorsville in the very thick underbrush and woods, completely scaring and frightening the Union troops and overwhelming them in defeat. Although Lee wins the battle at Chancellorsville, he suffers a significant loss. In many ways, the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville is a Pyrrhic victory because Lee loses one of his absolute best generals. This is Stonewall Jackson, who is actually the victim of a friendly fire incident in which one of the Confederate soldiers themselves actually accidentally shoots the famous general, and he dies in May in 1863. Once again, because of Hooker's failure at Chancellorsville, Lincoln replaces Hooker with General George Meade. That is very significant because he is going to score the greatest victory of the Union troops during the course of the Civil War. Once again, feeling very proud and very capable of his efforts and his strategy and the ability of the Southerners to defeat the Union troops on the battlefield, Robert E. Lee launches his second invasion of the North. The first was into Maryland and was stopped and stalemated at Antietam. The second invasion will go deeper, this time across the panhandle of Maryland into Pennsylvania, and again the goal of Lee is to circle down, cut off Washington, D.C., destroy the Union armies, take the capital, and win the war. General George Meade rallies the troops after Chancellorsville, quickly marches north, and both sides confront each other at the small town in Pennsylvania known as Gettysburg. Here, 3 intense days of fighting will occur, which in many ways will decide the fate of the war. The first day of Gettysburg takes place with some skirmishes on the north side of the town, in which the Confederates very quickly drive out the Union forces. That seemed like a victory for the Confederates because they took the town, but in reality, the Union troops were able to structure their fortifications along Cemetery Ridge to the south of town, which became a very important fixed and fortified position. On day 2 of the battle, larger numbers of reinforcements for both sides arrive, and the Union was able to really entrench along Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill and take the high ground, abutted against Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Seeing the strategic significance of these positions, Lee launches a massive attack against the Union lines throughout the day. Some of the fiercest fighting takes places in locations such as the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and also Devil's Den, in which there's often hand-to-hand combat or fixed bayonets occurring in much of this fighting across these open fields. The pivotal moment of day 2 takes place when General Longstreet realizes the significance of the high ground that is even higher than Cemetery Ridge on Little Round Top. And therefore, Lee orders Longstreet to send in his troops to take Little Round Top so they could set up gun emplacements and blast away at the Union lines below them. Therefore, some of the most intense fighting and dramatic takes place on top of Little Round Top, in which a group of Alabamans under the command of Colonel William Oates attack Little Round Top. Union positions are across the top of this little mountain, and the extreme edge is controlled by the 20th Maine under the command of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. There in the thicket and in the woods, Chamberlain orders his troops to hold their position at all costs. 6 times they're driven back from the wall. 6 times they regroup and take the wall back. And then finally, on the verge of being overwhelmed, Chamberlain does something incredibly unorthodox. Despite being out of ammunition, he orders his men to fix bayonets and charge down the hill. And as a result, the Confederates cannot believe what they are seeing. They are completely overwhelmed. They drop their weapons and run for their lives down the hill. Chamberlain and the 20th Maine's victory on Little Round Top secures control of the high ground during the second day of Gettysburg. On day 3 of the battle, Lee really believed that he was on the verge of victory. He believed he had almost won day 1, that he had almost done it on day 2, and now with one final push against the center of the Union lines, that the Confederates would be able to win the battle on day 3. Therefore, Lee really makes the only mistake he makes during the entire war, in which he orders Major General George Pickett and his Virginians to march straight across a wide open field, almost a mile long, straight into the Union guns. General Longstreet cannot believe that Lee is issuing this order and cannot audibly give the order, but simply nods his head to Pickett for Pickett's men to advance. And as a result, over this wide open field, almost 25,000 Confederates continued to march against the fixed guns of the Union lines. The Union lines watched them and admired the beauty and the discipline of the approaching Confederates. But once the command is given by General Meade, the Union guns open up all at once and blast into Pickett's line. The destruction is overwhelming. Heads, legs, torsos, arms are thrown into the air. In a moment, whole battalions are just wiped out by the Union guns. The Union soldiers who are firing the guns continue to chant Fredericksburg, 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 reminding them of the destruction that their comrades had faced at Fredericksburg over the wide open fields. Continually, the Confederates march on, continue to approach the Union guns. At certain points, actually take the wall, but then they are quickly beaten back by hand-to-hand fighting. The Union holds the line, and with so much destruction and death, finally Pickett's men are forced to retreat after the Union holds the line with an appalling number of somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 casualties in the course of Pickett's charge. General Lee meets the retreating Virginians as they return to their lines, yelling, I'm sorry, it's all my fault, it's all my fault." And when Pickett is ordered to regroup his men, of course he cannot because he has no regiment as a result. Therefore, after 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg, approximately 55,000 Americans are dead, slightly more on the Confederate side than the Union side. Roughly, that's the same number of Americans who will die in the Vietnam War are killed in 3 days in fighting at Gettysburg. There is a national cemetery soon constructed and expanded for all the Union dead who are lost at Gettysburg. In November of that year, the president is invited almost as an afterthought to deliver some remarks. And after a 2-hour address by the featured speaker, Edward Everett, President Lincoln stepped forward and delivers one of the most famous speeches in American history, which is the Gettysburg Address, calling for the war to continue and that these men shall not have died in vain, and a prayer that under God this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war is very taxing, of course, though, for the North, and indeed there are draft riots, particularly in New York, but also other U.S. cities, in which many Irish immigrants particularly feel that it is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, and that they are bearing the burden of the war. Those that could afford to do so could pay money for a substitute to serve their place in the Union armies, and it's often poor factory workers who are serving in Union lines, many immigrants as well. Eventually, the Union Army has to be called in to suppress some of the more violent elements of these New York draft riots. Meanwhile, with all this fighting in the East and in Virginia, there is an army commander out west who is enjoying a string of victories. This is General Ulysses S. Grant. His reputation was being unkempt and very and not neat, and also a drunk. But nevertheless, Grant is successful in winning battles at Fort Donelson and also Fort Henry, which gives the Union gunboats access to the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Grant also secures a major victory at the Battle of Shiloh in western Tennessee, in which some of the very fiercest fighting takes place at a location known as the Hornet's Nest, as the line continues to hold despite numerous Confederate advances. We also see the heroics of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who single-handedly charges into the Union lines and survives. Nathan Bedford Forrest will become the most feared cavalry officer among Confederate troops throughout the course of the war. After his victories at Fort Henry and also Fort Donelson and also Shiloh, Grant continues to march south in an effort to gain control of the Mississippi, lays siege to the last city that the Union does not control along the Mississippi. This is Vicksburg. Grant is going to conduct a siege of Vicksburg from May 18th all the way to the 4th of July of 1863. Finally, after Union troops blast away at Vicksburg and Grant's guns along the ground surround the city, the mayor of Vicksburg is forced to surrender to Grant the day after the victory at Gettysburg on July 4th, 1863. Thus, securing control of the Mississippi and then gradually Tennessee, The Union armies continued to march east and score victories at the Battle of Chickamauga, also the Battle of Missionary Ridge, and also the Battle of Lookout Mountain. Gradually, as the Union armies continued to march east, General William Tecumseh Sherman is identified as a very valuable asset for the Union command and will be given more important commands subsequent to these victories. The war actually touches Florida very little. Florida primarily is inhabited in the 1860s by Indians and escaped African slaves. There's far more of their population. However, there is a Union attempt to attack the Confederate capital of Tallahassee and take the state of Florida for the Union armies under the command of Truman Seymour. However, Confederate General Alfred Colquitt meets the Union troops at Olustee in North Florida, defeats them, and routs Truman Seymour's forces, pushing him back into Jacksonville for the remainder of the war. Thus, after taking Tennessee and securing control of the Mississippi, Grant decides to unleash General William Tecumseh Sherman, particularly against Georgia. Therefore, Sherman launches one of his very famous campaigns, moving across North Georgia, and after being beaten back momentarily at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, finally is able to push through and move against Atlanta, overwhelming the fortifications of this important railway and road center in the Confederate South. And once Atlanta, the city, is evacuated, all key strategic military buildings and economic buildings are burned in the famous burning of Atlanta in November of 1864. From this event, Sherman's army gains a reputation for its ruthlessness and its willingness to bring destruction all across the South, including the destruction of rail lines and depots across the state of Georgia. In the midst of this invasion of the South and the conduct of the war, the United States is forced to hold a presidential election. This is the election of 1864. And bitterly and ironically, it is the former General George McClellan, who Lincoln had removed from campaign for his obstinacy and also his unwillingness to aggressively prosecute the war, that becomes the candidate for the Democrats in 1864, challenging President Lincoln. Lincoln actually doesn't run technically as a Republican in 1864, but rather names his party the Union Party as an effort to preserve the Union, and chooses a very disliked Southerner from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, as his running mate, as an effort to promote unity with the South. Thus, the campaign to see to the defeat of Lincoln in 1864 is conducted by the Democrats, promising immediate peace and an end to the war. But nevertheless, with victories in Georgia, also at Gettysburg, the population in the North decides that it is best to stick with President Lincoln, and indeed he wins a resounding victory across the North and a mandate to continue the war. General Sherman decides to do exactly that with his invasion of the state of Georgia. This is when he conducts his very famous March to the Sea, in which Sherman will cut a 2-mile wide swath of destruction, burning, and disrepair across the South. He destroys farmyards and plantations, slaughter cattle and hogs, anything that would enable the South to continue its conduct of the war is destroyed. Particularly rail lines are ripped up, and then the iron is melted, wrapped around trees, and identified as Sherman neckties. And also there are whole railroad depots and entire train yards that are burned and destroyed. 425 miles are traversed by Sherman's army, and they conduct a total of $100 million of damage. There are still chimneys that remain today across Georgia from a house that Sherman's army had burned, known as Sherman Sentinels, and also factories as well. Finally, Sherman moves all the way to the coast and secures the key city of Savannah along the coast, wiring President Lincoln that I offer you the gift of the city of Savannah for the Christmas of 1864. Then Sherman continues to march north, deep into the Confederacy, going into South Carolina, the seedbed of rebellion and secession, and is even more aggressive against the South Carolinian capital of Columbia than he was against Atlanta, burning the entire city and destroying everything in his path. Meanwhile, in the East, Philip Sheridan really reenacts the Valley Campaign of Jackson of a couple of years before. Sheridan marches through the Shenandoah Valley, destroying anything of value to the Confederates. The Shenandoah Valley had become a valuable supply route of food and fodder for the Confederate Army and the Army in Northern Virginia. So Sheridan's army conducts what is called the burning and his destruction of the Shenandoah Valley. With Grant's successes in the West, President Lincoln believes he has finally found his general, so he reassigns Grant to the East to take command of the Army of the Potomac. And Grant has a mandate to relentlessly, almost recklessly, attack Lee at every point. Therefore, Lee is besieged by Grant. Grant continues to try to outflank Lee's army, and at every point, Lee matches him, follows him all the way down the peninsula, all the way to the Battle of Cold Harbor. The Battle of Cold Harbor, some of the most horrific casualties take place as Confederate guns blast the Union assault on June 3rd, and within 7 minutes inflict 7,000 casualties. Finally, Grant settles in for a long siege, not against Richmond, but against Petersburg, a key Confederate city to the south. This siege will last from June 9th all the way to March 25th of 1865. This is when the American Civil War clearly looks a lot like World War I, which would occur about 50 years later, including trench fortifications, also large mortars, and also the introduction of mines in warfare with the famous Battle of the Crater, in which Pennsylvania coal miners dug a long tunnel all the way under the Confederate lines, eventually packing it with explosives, blowing up the Confederate lines on July 30th, 1864 at 4:44 in the morning. Union troops rushed down into the crater caused by the explosion, but once they are down into the crater, they realize they have not brought ladders with them, and then the Confederate troops reassemble on the ridge of the crater and then shoot them down inside of the crater. Finally, the war moves forward when Lee is out of supplies, out of food, out of shoes, and running low on ammunition, is forced to evacuate Petersburg, surrendering it to General Grant. Grant takes Petersburg and then rather easily, finally, moves against the Confederate capital at Richmond. With the fall of Richmond of April 2nd, 1865, Confederates who were retreating and plundering the city set fire to the city, and as a result, the Confederate capital, symbol of all its glory, is completely destroyed by very large hot fires across the city. Finally, with Grant at his heels, chasing him all the way across and often circling him and outflanking him, Lee finally is surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, a town in western Virginia, and he admits that he has to go surrender to Grant, which indeed he does with the surrender of Appomattox at April 9th, 1865, in the front parlor of the house of Wilbur McLean in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. With the end of the war, some of the ugliest parts of the war are revealed, including the Confederate prisoner of war camp at Andersonville, Georgia. This camp was completely overcrowded with far too many thousands of prisoners that the camp couldn't handle. There are really no sanitary facilities, and there's no clean water. And as a result, the rate from death and disease is horrific. Victims of Andersonville look like Holocaust survivors from the Second World War. And Commandant Hunley, who is in charge of the Andersonville camp, will be one of only 2 individuals executed for war crimes because of his failure to improve the conditions at Andersonville, where 13,000 died in the camp. Lincoln indeed is reelected in the November of 1864, and then on March 4th, 1865, issues his famous second inaugural address. In his second inaugural address, he lays out his plan for reconstructing the nation and peace, and also a policy of forgiveness. In the crowd that day, as Lincoln delivers the second inaugural address, is a very discontented Southerner, John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth reads in the newspaper and hears from a friend that the president will be attending the theater at Ford's Theater shortly after his second inaugural. Therefore, John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor, decides also to go to Ford's Theater, where the president arrives for the play late. John Wilkes Booth believed that by assassinating the president, the South would rise again, that he would bring everlasting fame to his very famous acting family, and the South would rally and then eventually win the war. So thus, in the middle of the play, John Wilkes Booth emerges with his dagger and single-shot Derringer pistol and fires a shot at the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Lincoln hunches over, his wife screams, Major Rathbone jumps up from his seat in an effort to subdue Booth. Booth slashes him with a dagger, and then Booth jumps from the presidential viewing box onto the stage in the middle of the play, probably yelling Sic Semper Tyrannis, which was the Virginia state motto, thus ever to tyrants, and runs away. Emergency CPR is performed on the president, and then his body is taken out of the theater and then crossed the street into the Peterman House, and there Abraham Lincoln dies shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning in that house. Lincoln's funeral train thereafter conducts his body across the country after lying in state in the White House, and the funeral train moves up from Washington, D.C. to key cities such as Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and also New York City. As he is moving through, the funeral train is being moved through New York City, a very young Teddy Roosevelt stands from his grandfather's window watching the deceased president pass by. Eventually, Abraham Lincoln is buried in his native Springfield, Illinois, with his wife and also children. There is a reward sent out on an effort to arrest John Wilkes Booth. Everyone recognized him as the murderer. Turns out Booth was not alone. He had a series of conspirators with him. There was also an attempt by Lewis Powell against Secretary of State William Seward that night that failed. There were also other plans to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, also General Ulysses S. Grant, but the other conspirators back out. When Booth leaves the theater that night, he continues to move south, trying to get to the South, where he believes he will be greeted as a hero and rally the Southern armies. He indeed crosses the Potomac River, but the United States Army is hot on his heels and gradually corners him at the Garrett farmhouse, where he is cornered in a tobacco barn, shot by Boston Corbett, and eventually John Wilkes Booth dies on the porch from that farm. The other conspirators are tried, and many of them are either imprisoned or indeed executed, including Lewis Powell. After the American Civil War, it is Montgomery Meigs who designs an official cemetery, a national cemetery for the Union dead in the course of the Civil War, and he is considered the founder of Arlington National Cemetery, that eventually grows to be the nation's important large cemetery honoring its dead who had fought in its battles. Also, what we would identify as the Congressional Medal of Honor is also introduced in the course of the American Civil War. The American Civil War results in the death of 650,000 Americans. Slightly more on the Confederate side, but nevertheless, the losses on both sides are immense. Half of the country is left in a state of total destruction in the South. The Southern way of life and its economy and its political institutions are completely destroyed and left in disrepair. And the great question that emerges even before the war is over is, how is the country to put itself back together? What will be the policy towards these Southerners and these Southern states that had left the Union and had committed secession? These are the questions that emerge during the Reconstruction period, that somewhat emerged during the course of the war and are debated and discussed and planned, but really take full force after the conclusion of the war, beginning in April of 1865, and usually the end of the Reconstruction period is identified in 1877. One of the prime questions, of course, is the rebuilding of the South, which had been completely destroyed, particularly by Sherman's armies, but also numerous battles across its frontiers, and therefore there's a need for immediate economic aid for much of the South. As a result, one of the first initiatives that Congress launches is the Freedmen's Bureau. This was really designed to help former slaves to have food, also some education. It established schools and also some local hospitals as well. Generally, former slaves received no care whatsoever from their former owners and masters in the South. Therefore, they are dependent through the Freedmen's Bureau on the federal government for much of their way of life. The Freedmen's Bureau is generally underfunded, and the federal government has a limited commitment to the success of the Freedmen's Bureau. It does establish some schools and some hospitals across the South, and a greater legacy is established by the Union General Oliver Howard, who establishes Howard University, a traditional black school, in 1867. With the presence of Union troops in the South, for the first time, African Americans are voting in the South, participating in county, city, and also statewide elections. The only reason that African Americans are able to vote is because Union soldiers are making sure that the voting process has been extended, courtesy of the 14th Amendment, without regards to race across the South. As a result, we see for the first time the election of several African Americans to state senates and state houses of representatives, but also Congress, and even a few senators sent to the United States Senate who are African American. We also see the ratification by Congress in the states of what is called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery or involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment, which provided a definition for citizenship in the United States. And then the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, which was very important, of course, for African Americans in the South. Now, before his assassination, Lincoln had proposed a very forgiving Reconstruction plan, a plan that included a general amnesty for Southerners, a simple allegiance oath, and the insurance of the right to vote to landowning blacks, and only 10% of a state's population needed to admit to the allegiance oath in order to be readmitted to the Union. Congress began to squabble with President Lincoln even before the end of the war. The Wade-Davis plan was a bit more severe, a little bit more vengeful, and required more of the South before its readmission to the Union. Of course, the debate between Lincoln and Wade-Davis is rendered mute with Lincoln's assassination, and then resumes with the ascension of Vice President Andrew Johnson to the presidency. Andrew Johnson generally was poor, but a politician from Tennessee, and he hated the Southern plantation elite, and they had much resentment for him as well. He's viewed in the South as a traitor to the cause. Johnson also had very little affection for African Americans. In many ways, he may have been the most racist president in the United States history. Nevertheless, he is sworn in as president upon Lincoln's assassination and immediately demonstrates his indifference to the Freedmen's Bureau and the plight of African Americans in the South. Johnson tries to propose a plan that was forgiving, but certainly a little bit more restrictive and demanding than Lincoln's plan was. But eventually, Johnson's plan is removed and replaced by that of the radical Republicans. It is really Congress, led by Republicans who are interested in enacting their revenge against the South, that will finally enact and lead their Reconstruction plan. The radical Republicans, under the leadership of Congressman Thaddeus Stevens and now returned Senator Charles Sumner to the United States Senate, enact a very punishing and demanding Reconstruction plan on the South. This includes the calling of state conventions in the South to write new constitutions, that Confederate office holders are temporarily banned from office, Confederate supporters must be pardoned by 2/3 vote of Congress. The South will be treated like a military-conquered area and divided into military districts with military governors. They also demanded the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and its enforcement. Indeed, these plans are passed in Congress over many of the vetoes of President Johnson and implemented with military reconstruction. This is exactly the plan and the approach that President Lincoln wanted to avoid. Lincoln wanted a very forgiving plan in which the South are treated as brothers who had come home. Nevertheless, the vengeance of the radical Republicans treats the South like a military-occupied country, with Union troops stationed across Confederate governments, making sure that Republicans are elected to these legislatures and seats of governors, and that African Americans are voting in the South. Moreover, the South not only feels politically oppressed and and punished by the North. They also feel that they're being taken advantage of economically, with scalawags who were Southerners who would work with these Northerners to ensure the election of Republicans. They were betraying their fellow Southerners in being compliant and supportive, particularly African Americans who are looking for their right to vote, but also carpetbaggers who were Northern merchants who were rumored to come down from the North with a large bag covered with carpet that included inflated goods, and they price gouged the Southerners in their time of need. So as a result, the South feels abused in regards to its politics and also its economics. And many white Southerners are horrified by the reality of African Americans voting and the Union armies protecting them, and even achieving the election of African Americans to statewide and national offices. As a result, a secret terrorist organization emerges in the South, Pulaski, Tennessee, known as the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan originally was founded as a veterans organization, but gradually it becomes a military wing or a paramilitary group to move against Union-supported Republican governments in the South. And as a result, the Klan used violence and intimidation to prevent blacks from voting or receiving federal aid and owning land. The first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan was the famous Confederate cavalry officer Nathan Bedford Forrest. The Klan, of course, enacted violence all across the South, harassing and attacking African Americans and also white Southerners who would support these Union-supported Republican governors in the South. This is when we see the large scale practice of lynching, particularly in the South, in which without a trial and without a real court of law, blacks are accused of crimes and simply hang from local trees, and also the process of convict leasing. Many African Americans are forced to return to the plantations that they had been emancipated from as slaves. They are forced to return to these plantations as work as sharecroppers or through the crop lien system, in which they wouldn't get paid, but in an effort to rebuild the plantation, they were allowed to take a measure of the food from the fields that they were involved in planting in the plantation. Some of them actually live in the same slave huts they had when they were slaves on the same plantation as the only place to have a dwelling and also some food. Other African Americans, of course, across the South, faced with harsh penalties, and Southern governments would often lease out convicted blacks of some random crime like loitering or littering, and then hire them out to white masters. So in other words, the convict leasing system in many ways is just slavery by another name. Gradually, Southern governments also passed what become known as black codes. These are very restrictive laws against the political and economic involvement of African Americans in the South, in which blacks were prohibited from gathering together or voting, prohibited from holding weapons or serving on juries. There are also laws against blacks marrying or fathering children with whites. Unemployed and vagrant blacks were arrested and assigned for convict leasing, and some Southern states even prohibit land ownership by blacks. As a result, with the introduction of the black codes often enforced through the Ku Klux Klan, we have the emergence of Jim Crow South. By Jim Crow South, we mean the segregated society of the South, which will become a reality, and the reduction and eventually elimination of black voting in the South all the way to the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. On the national scene, it is clear that Congress gains control of military reconstruction over the repeated vetoes of President Johnson. Indeed, Johnson in many ways is the most hated man in America, distrusted by his fellow Southerners, but also hated by members of his own Republican Party who wanted a much more radical form of Reconstruction. Therefore, the radical Republicans conspire a plan in order to eliminate and remove Johnson from office. They pass what was probably unconstitutional, the Tenure of Office Act, which required the president to consult with Congress before he fired a member of his cabinet. Johnson knows that it's a trap and nevertheless antagonizes radical Republicans by firing his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton is fired, and as a result, Congress immediately votes articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson that he had broken the law. A trial is held in the Senate, And by one vote, Andrew Johnson is able to survive his impeachment trial and remain in office, although, of course, he will not receive his party's nomination and be reelected. Johnson indeed does survive the impeachment vote to remain in office. Thus, he becomes the first president to be impeached during the Reconstruction period in subsequent American history. Re-election campaign of Johnson is therefore a non-issue in 1868, and so in 1868 we see the nomination for president of General Grant, and he easily wins election in 1868, particularly with Union troops still stationed in southern polling stations, making sure that African Americans are going to vote. African Americans are, of course, going to vote for Republican candidates, the party that had achieved their emancipation. And as a result, Grant wins election in 1868. Grant originally was from Ohio, and he enjoys a long-term military campaign. He had served in the Mexican-American War and, of course, earned fame during the course of the American Civil War, eventually in command of Union armies, particularly in the Virginia theater. He is inaugurated as president in March of 1869, and one of the pieces of legislation that's important that he passed includes the Ku Klux Klan Act. In some ways, this act was one of the first civil rights acts in that it empowered the president to suppress state disorders and granted the power to the president to suspend habeas corpus to arrest individuals of the members of the Ku Klux Klan who otherwise Southern governments would certainly not arrest and prosecute. We do see these paramilitary societies across the South, including the Ku Klux Klan, also the Red Shirts, also the White League, enacting some of the more famous massacres, including the Colfax Massacre, which occurred in Louisiana on Easter Sunday in 1873. In 1872, Grant is reelected again. He holds the first state dinner in presidential history, White House history, by granting the King of Hawaii a state dinner. President Grant, however, is best known for the scandals that really rock his administration and really weaken his authority as a leader. In many ways, Grant's reputation is tarnished by his presidency, where he was such a national hero after the Civil War and his generalship. The scandals of the Grant administration tarnish his reputation as an effective leader. The most famous scandal is the railroad scandal known as the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which inflated charges were billed to the government and bribes were granted to key government officials, including the Vice President, Treasury Secretary, Senators, and the Speaker of the House. There are other scandals as well, including involving Native Americans and also the whiskey ring scandal that were quite famous. As a result, Grant, after 2 terms, leaves in somewhat dishonor from the White House. Eventually, Grant will die of throat cancer, but he writes his memoirs, which are published shortly after his death, securing a great fortune for his family trust. In 1876, there is another presidential election, this time between the governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate, and the Ohio governor, Rutherford B. Hayes. When the electoral votes are counted, there are a vast discrepancy and great fraud, particularly in the 3 states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. It is unclear exactly where these electoral votes belong because there's so much fraudulent voting. As a result, an electoral commission is appointed by Congress to determine where these votes should go. Historians guess that most likely they actually belong to Samuel J. Tilden, thus securing the White House for the Democrats for the first time after the American Civil War. However, it's clear the North exercises a lot of influence in Congress, and they are pushing for these electoral votes to go to their candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. As a result, there is probably a great deal of backroom dealing by this electoral commission, and finally a compromise is issued known as the Compromise of 1877. In this compromise, Rutherford B. Hayes will be awarded the contested electoral votes, thus securing his administration. He will become president. However, the South will get really what it wants. The removal of all Union troops will be removed from Southern states. Also, the appointment of a Southerner as Postmaster General, the construction of a new Southern Transcontinental Railroad, and additional funds to rebuild the South, and a promise that there will be no more federal interference regarding blacks in the South, particularly their process of voting. So, in a climate of scandal and fraud, Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidency in 1876. As a result, the Union troops are pulled out of the South, and now Democrats, former white plantation owners, the leaders of the Confederacy, are able to gain control of their state governments again, disenfranchise black voters, making sure that they are not voting through intimidation and poll taxes and literacy tests and violence, and through the use of the Ku Klux Klan, and gain control of the Southern governments. As a result, we see the emergence of what becomes known as the Solid South. The predictable result that the Southern states will always vote for the Democratic candidate because it was the Republicans that had invaded the South, the Republicans that had emancipated the slaves. Therefore, the South will always vote for Democrats. That is pretty much the reality of the Solid South in national elections all the way to the 1950s and the election of Dwight Eisenhower. The bitter legacy of Reconstruction, of course, for African Americans is that it leaves them without Union protection, Union soldiers protecting their right to vote or any type of economic activity. And very quickly, Southerners are left in a state of Jim Crow segregation, economic disenfranchisement, and also the lack of opportunity to vote through fear, intimidation, and numerous false literacy tests. And white Southerners gain control of white Southern governments. This is the bitter legacy of Reconstruction that is certainly going to endure for African Americans all the way to the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s.